the farming came and little teeny strips of land near the coast, rocky soil, rough times. A lot of people have announced that the geography of Greece is the reason for its culture. Now, you know, the great cities, or the great nations of history, the Egyptians and then the Persian empires, the massive empires arise in large river valleys where you can unite the population. That's why civilization arose, the productivity of the area. Why did the brilliance of Greek culture arise? And some say it's the splinteredness of the landscape. But there are other splintered landscapes, you know. Abyssinia is splintered. What's that? Ethiopia? That's splintered. Same thing as Abyssinia, by the way. For whatever the reason is, let us continue here on page 187. Greece was thus fragmented into a host of tiny districts, many of which we shall meet later as independent states. So it's very difficult for these places to communicate either by land or by sea in some cases, because they have to go all the way around the other side of the Greek peninsula. They're cut off by land, very rough, rugged terrain. Now, Greek history, quote, was not simply an expression of its geographic framework, but the influences of topography and climate were important. Diversity was encouraged, and yet seaborne forces tended to link all parts of this world. The Greeks accordingly developed a common pattern of civilization which nonetheless had many local variations. I think we might have skipped over the part that mentions this quite a bit earlier, but it's in earlier migrations and anthropological type information. The Greeks that we are studying are migrants from the Dorians, which means the Europeans basically. People from Europe migrated down out of Macedonia. Macedonia, again, is just the region north of Greece. People migrated down into Greece proper. Now, the natives that were there went up into the highlands. Even centuries later, during the golden ages of Greece, in the highlands were tribes that had been native, the native cultural tribes. So the people who pushed down from the north and inhabited Greece are the Greeks that we think of. They aren't the actual native Greeks. The actual native Greeks were relegated to little villages high up in the mountains. But anyways, trade and industry were facilitated by the abundance of harbors. I mean, lots of places have a lot of harbors, so they were facilitated by harbors, but not caused by it. Facilitated also by the normally calm waters of the Aegean in the summer, and by the fact that no part of Greece was more than a day or two on foot from the sea. That's one interesting thing. You look at it, it's just lots of little fingers of land going everywhere, so it's very difficult to live very far from the sea. Pretty much anybody in Greece is involved with the sea, kind of like Britain. You don't live far from the sea if you live in Britain. Now, as I understood it, Isaac Newton didn't see the ocean ever, or until much later in life, until much later I think it was, and lived only 20 or 30 kilometers from the ocean. One should not, however, make the mistake of assuming that at any stage in Hellenic history most men were sailors. Like I said, they had something to do with the sea, but as it turns out, it was pretty unproductive to go on the ocean. You couldn't really make a living. Most people were still stuck on the land trying to scratch some living out of the soil. Therefore, they were, quote, home-abiding farmers living off bread, cheese, wine, and a few other staples. Skipping down a wage to the next page. Good timber for ships and for shipbuilding was very rare, but olive trees and vines could be grown widely. Olive trees are not the best lumber for shipbuilding. Crystalline layers along the western shores of the Aegean provided veins of silver, copper, and other metals. Very rich in certain metals, but get this, Greece had usually to import large parts of its needs in metals. They had to import their metal needs because it was more developed over towards the center of civilization, which was Iraq at the time. Here and in the islands, the rock was often marble of good quality. Skipping down just a bit. An enduringly important influence on Greek history was its position relative to other principal centers of population and culture. It is sort of right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, isn't it? As we saw in Chapter 5, migrations from the land mass of Europe could sweep down into Greece, though only after traversing the broken mountainous Balkans. Traders with wares, ideas, and techniques from the Near East could make their way to the Aegean, though only after skirting the dangerous southern coast of Asia Minor. Owing to this factor, the major political and cultural centers of historic Greece were located along the eastern coast, where the inhabitants could reach the Aegean and tap the influences from the Near East, even if, and get this, the more favored lands from the point of view of rainfall and agricultural potential stretched along the western coast of Greece proper. So the prevailing weather patterns go this direction. So that means that the rain is going to fall mostly on this side, and as the air and so on goes up over top the mountains and so on, the rain gets wrung out over here, and this over here, this side is in the rain shadow. It's drier. However, civilization developed more thoroughly there because of the access to the east, the closer proximity to the east. So then it turns out that Greece is on the frontiers of Europe and Asia. It's sort of like the last thing in Europe before they go to Asia, and it's sort of like the end of Asia, and then there's the Greeks. They sort of were in this nexus, this flux, this twilight zone. So they were not necessarily subject to, quote, direct continuous influence from either direction. Now it talks about a dark age here, and it's important to know that this dark age is not the capital D dark ages that you and I know about. So this dark age is actually a dark age that happens from about 1000 to about 800 BC, before Christ. From 1000 to 800 BC in the area we're concerned with, that area around Greece proper, the islands to the east, the west, the end of Italy, and so forth. Quote, during the Dark Ages, the Aegean was almost completely isolated from outside contacts, a point of great importance in facilitating the emergence of the historic Greek outlook. I don't know how true that is, but they certainly were largely isolated. We can tell that from, trade patterns, pottery and stuff. We can tell it was a very non-interactive culture at the time. Mycenaean collapse and Aegean reorganization. So we're talking now about the period from 1200 BC to 750 BC. It's a 450-year period. At the end of this is sort of like the Renaissance and civilization sort of reborn. During the Minoan and Mycenaean periods of the second millennium BC, the powerful lords of the palaces had had wide contacts with the Near East and had borrowed much from its Bronze Age cultures. At least on the mainland, the dominant element had spoken Greek since the invasions early in the second millennium, but politically and culturally, Mycenaean civilization differed sharply from that which was to flourish later in historic Greece. The Mycenaean world seems to have been declining by the 13th century BC, but a violent invasion, remembered as the coming of the Dorians, brought it to an end just after 1200. They were declining, it says. Now, maybe they would have been able to stave off the Dorians if they weren't in decline, but it's a good thing the Dorians came, because the Dorians became what we would know of as the Greeks. So, in the Near East, similar waves of invasion had had serious results. In Greece, the effects were catastrophic. The use of writing vanished once the palaces had been sacked and their royal bureaucracies dispersed. Artists and architects no longer had patrons, let alone security. Overseas trade virtually ended. Settled agricultural life itself may have become impossible in the more exposed districts, for archaeological evidence for villages in the Dark Ages is only spottily available. By the year 1000 BC, life in Greece had sunk to a bare level of subsistence, either by farming or by nomadism, and remained on this level for 2 centuries. The world outside Greece became an area of fable, populated by monsters and strange races. As they withdrew into themselves, they knew less and less about the world. Although the picture is bleak and dark, very important developments for the future